Hi, I'm Jarrett Fuller. Welcome to Scratching the Surface. I am now a few weeks into teaching for this new semester. There's a new group of students, new courses, new ideas, and I don't know about you, but I've been thinking a lot about the role of higher education this summer, and specifically art and design higher education here in the United States, but in some ways all around the world. There's been this attack on education, attack on the role of the expert, an attack in some ways on knowledge itself. And I've been trying to figure out if and how art and design fits into this current moment, this current crisis of higher education. And so for this first episode back from our summer break, I thought it'd be interesting to talk about these big ideas with someone who's also been thinking about them a lot. And so today on the show, I am joined by the President and Vice-Chancellor of the Royal College of Art, Christoph Lindner. Christoph was appointed to this position in April of this year, and so it was a really interesting time to catch him as he's settling into this new role, thinking about what the RCA is and can be, and how to run and manage a public research art and design postgraduate university in the United Kingdom. Prior to this role, Christoph served as the Dean of the Bartlett Faculty of the Built Environment at University College London, and before that, he was the Dean of the College of Design at University of Oregon, where he led a comprehensive restructuring and renaming of the college. Christoph is an interdisciplinary scholar of cities and visual culture, and he's authored and edited over 15 books across art, architecture, media, and cultural studies, and has worked to advance educational access and equity, interdisciplinary research, and environmental sustainability. So in this conversation, Christoph and I talk about how he entered into this new role at the RCA and the role of a public research-focused art and design education. We also talk through the role more generally of higher education and how art and design has and can navigate this current moment. This is a deep and thoughtful and in many ways searching conversation that I found really helpful in my own thinking about what we do as art and design educators. I hope that you feel the same way. Scratching the Surface is supported by listeners like you. If you like what we do here, please consider supporting us on Patreon or on our Substack. Over the summer, we launched a new open access monthly newsletter filled with design news, updates on previous guests, book roundups, and so much more. You can head over to our website to sign up and get Scratching the Surface in your inbox every month. It's really good to be back. We have a great new slate of episodes coming up. Thank you so much for listening. And here is my conversation with Christoph Lindner. Congratulations on the new job. You're a couple months into it now, and I hope this first question is not a dumb question, but I was thinking about you. I was thinking about everything I want to talk to you about. And I'm wondering, how do you come into an institution like the RCA? How do you prepare for stepping into this role? Is there a mandate that is given to you? Do you have a sort of personal mandate or set of goals? How do you wrap your head around everything that's happening? Can you just sort of tell me about what these last couple of months have been like and how you sort of prepared yourself for them?
Great question. And the first thing I would say is that I don't know how university presidents ever did this before there was the internet. Because the best way in the early weeks before you join to really start diving in, trying to get a sense of what's going on, is just to go as deep and spend as much time as you can on the university website and explore all of the nooks and crannies and especially the website of art and design schools, where there's so much visual material, creative material, interactive material. During the pandemic, lots of places, including the RCA, created online exhibitions. The ghosts and remnants of those are still around. So there's lots of ways in which you can get a good digital deep dive into
Mm.
an institution before you join. But that doesn't really tell you about the place. It gives you a sense of the place. And what I try to do in my early months here is to spend as much time with people as possible, with our community, with faculty, students, staff, just talking with people, trying to understand their work, understand their experiences, and listen to what they have to say. And then putting those two things together, the image of a place that we create and curate digitally and share externally, and then the reality of a place as you live and experience it on a day-to-day basis, and the bridges between the two.
What is your sense or your image of the place now that you've been there? What have you learned in that process of meeting people, sitting in, being sort of in the community? What have you learned that you don't learn on the website?
So one of the things I love about the RCA is how vibrant our spaces are.
Mm.
And like any art and design school, we're constantly making things, breaking things, experimenting with things. And before joining the RCA, I'd been through our three London campuses a number of times as part of the summer shows. And then
Mm.
you see a very clean, curated presentation of the
Right.
school. But what I really love is being in the studio before the summer show and seeing all of the work that has to happen in order to produce that final last piece that you want to put on display, and seeing piles of things and art leaning against doors,
Right.
and stuff pinned to the ceiling, all the unexpected sights and sounds and experiences of an art school when it's doing its thing, which is to make and create.
The RCA is a public research university. It's the only entirely postgraduate art and design university in the UK. And I don't I don't want you to answer this from a marketing standpoint. I don't want you to answer this about why students should go to the RCA, but I'm curious intellectually, philosophically, what do you see as the role of the RCA today, or the role of institutions like yours, um, for culture and for students today? How do you sort of think about your place there?
That's something that we across the institution spend a lot of time thinking and talking about quite actively. And it's important to do so because we are in an era when higher education, especially public higher education, is under a lot of stress and scrutiny and resource challenge.
Yeah.
But also, there's amazing opportunity in the world right now in terms of the ways in which creative practice in art and design can contribute and be part of solving the big challenges of our world. So, this is something we spend a lot of time thinking and talking about. And my answer to that question is we don't just have one role. We have a
Mm.
number of roles that we're able to play as a postgraduate institution. One of those roles is because we are postgraduate, all of our students arrive with a certain level of skills experience. They arrive very focused on what they want to achieve in their studies. And so we are a community that really, really tries to make the most intense use of our time together
Mm.
during a
Mm.
degree. And the other thing is because we are a public research university specializing in art and design, all of our faculty are research active. And so the link that we always like to imagine in higher education between the student experience and learning on the one side and research and creative inquiry and experiment on the other, here at the RCA, those two worlds are completely and totally blended. And that is a great, great strength of the place. I think that's one of the things that our students really appreciate. But I also know as a researcher, and I'm sure you've experienced this, that our own research practice is strengthened and enhanced when we have students engaging with our work, questioning it,
Right.
challenging it, critiquing it. So the benefit cuts both ways.
You saw exactly where I was taking that question, because I sort of have a series of I'm not even sure if I have clear, articulate questions. I kind of want to talk through this with you a little bit because I sort of am interested in this attack on higher education, this sort of, low key, sustained, at least in the United States, right wing attack on knowledge, on intellectualism, on higher education. And I think weirdly, art and design education have somehow sort of stayed out of that conversation in some ways. I feel like those attacks are not as strong. And I'm wondering sort of how you think about art education, art and design education in this culture where intellectualism, knowledge, the expert are under attack, are not seen as valuable as they once were. I like I said, I'm not sure I have a clear question there, but I'm curious how you're thinking about that now. Do you do you know what I mean? Does that make
I
sense?
know I know exactly what you
Okay.
mean, and that resonates quite powerfully. And I think it's interesting that you're currently talking to me from the US. I'm here in the UK, and there are both similarities and differences between those landscapes.
Yeah.
Um, but the thing that is kind of similar across geographies at the moment is that public higher education is not being adequately funded. And whatever system you're in, whether it's continental Europe or, Australia, New Zealand, the US, Canada, here in the UK, public institutions are really, really struggling financially to survive and thrive. And on top of that, we have an obligation, an ethical commitment to making education accessible and affordable as much as we can to our students. And so that means we have to make the resources we do get stretch as far as possible. Then you can overlay on top of that some version of a culture war. You described a particular version of it that's unfolding in the US. The UK has, a somewhat similar version, although we just had a change of government
Right.
from a conservative government to a Labour government. So I think we can expect some change in policy and also hopefully just a cooling down of the whole culture war rhetoric. But you also mentioned, and this is the part of your question that really interests me, you also mentioned that within all of this attack on expertise, on knowledge, on the role of learning and understanding, that art and design education has been kept a little bit out of it. And I kind of suspect that that's partly a reflection of the ways in which media and mainstream politics fail to recognize the truly subversive potential and political nature of art and design.
Yeah.
So really focused right now, that cultural war rhetoric on political science, on sociology, around issues of EDI, or what in the US you would call
Mhm.
DEI. Also seeing, science, engineering, medicine as disciplines that can be practically applied to different issues and therefore need to be controlled and directed in the right political ways. And through all of this, art and design has maybe escaped a little bit of the attention that we don't want. And yet we are intimately involved in all of the same debates, discussions, and you cannot really separate art and design from politics and knowledge production. A couple of years ago, I organized a workshop, actually on the West Coast in California,
Mm.
um, as part of a meeting of this journal that I work with called Places Journal.
Mm.
And this was a workshop on anti-knowledge and trying to reflect on uh, the strange phenomenon whereby we, in today's world, seem to reject the expert. We increasingly seem to want to refuse knowledge
Right.
and resent understanding.
Yeah.
And these are very strange things if you live and work in a university where you can almost take those things for granted, is
Yeah.
that's why we exist, that's what we do. And that workshop was before the pandemic. And during the pandemic, I noticed two things. I mean, I'm sure we all noticed loads of things, but there are two things that I really noticed just based on my own lockdown experience here in London, that I was desperately in need of two things: knowledge from an expert, mostly about vaccines and medicine and public
Yeah.
health, and art and culture in
Mm.
order to give meaning to to life, meaning to the time and space and experience, and also to help process and understand what we were going through. And I found that conjunction really fascinating on a daily basis, reaching out, looking for expertise and creativity.
I think you're exactly right. And this has me thinking, I haven't fully articulated this because I haven't fully thought this through until your answer there. But, so much of this, and I want to be very careful about how I realize we're wading into some touchy subjects here, but so much of this, these sort of culture war discussions are about free speech, about the ideologies that are embedded in how we teach something. And I think you're exactly right that art and design are sort of deeply embedded in that, but their power has not been recognized. And so I'm wondering, is there something that academia at large can learn from how we talk about and teach art and design, how we can create cultures for varying viewpoints, for subversiveness, for critical thinking, that art and design does really well, that could be opened up in some way?
I guess I would ask in return, how much do we want to open that up? In
That's
other
why
words,
I said I haven't fully thought this through.
what are we inviting in?
Yeah.
And what makes me ask that in response is, look what happened with the appropriation of the concept of design thinking, which in its very early days in the 60s and early 70s was a big intellectual genesis, in fact, of the RCA. This is one of the places where that very phrase, that very
Yeah.
concept was developed. And look how that concept went viral. It traveled across disciplines and eventually was very actively kind of colonized and used in business school
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
entrepreneurship kind of spaces and so
Yeah.
on. And that's great. I mean, ideas should travel, knowledge should be shared. We should want to exchange across disciplines. Um, Something I think that art and design does very well. We're not unique in our disciplines to do this well, but it is something we do well, which is to be able to accommodate huge differences,
Mm,
whether it's aesthetic, in practice, in methods, material, viewpoints, values, that we are communities that contain and activate critical dialogue around all kinds of differences at all different
yeah.
scales. And over time, I think in art education, we've developed the skills to uh, facilitate those kinds of debates and discussions. So we can have very difficult, very complex, very nuanced and delicate conversations. We might call them critiques, we might call them
Mm,
exchanges
yeah.
um, around differences of viewpoint, and work through them without necessarily falling out and creating polarized environments. So if we look at our social and cultural landscape going forward, is there a need to be less polarized, less divisive in our everyday kind of rhetoric? And I would say yes. I think that's
Right.
quite clear
Right.
across the globe in so many different spaces. And maybe art and design, some of the methods of interaction engagement that we have could find a wider application. I just wonder, if we do that, in what ways will it be twisted?
Right. Yeah. Yeah. No, I totally agree with you there. And that's why I was sort of like, as I was asking the question, I was like, I'm not actually sure I like what I'm about to say. I mean, I almost wonder if there's something, you're starting to hit on this a little bit. Um, and I'm going to make a very broad blanket statement here that I don't 100% stand behind. But higher education is often described as a type of job training. And I feel like you don't see that as much in art and design, especially in art. There's a sense of critical thinking, of asking the questions about why you are doing what you are doing, that maybe are not as common in the sciences, for example. And again, I'm generalizing here. And if there is something about the critique of asking these hard questions about complexity that is helpful, that has allowed art and design to sort of stay out of that conversation in some way. Like I said, I'm thinking about all of this as we're talking, but I don't know, does that resonate with you at all?
So maybe part of what you're touching on is some of the freedom,
Mm,
intellectual, creative freedom that exists in an art and design educational community where people's professional and creative futures are perhaps less mapped than in other
that's
disciplines.
that's exactly right.
And
Yeah.
so I've always found it a little bit of uh, uh, a discomfort actually to have many of our programs labeled as professional degrees
Uh,
because it suggests a certain utilitarianism to what we're doing. You study this, you get this job, you have this career. And if you actually look at graduates of the RCA, graduates of any art and design school, what you see, particularly in today's world, that people's career paths, their life paths, are much more circuitous and hybrid. They're very rarely
yeah.
linear
Yeah.
in the way that a professional degree would suggest. And there's nothing wrong with being professional. It means, being an expert and an advanced practitioner in something, whether it's dentistry or
Hmm.
heart
Hmm.
surgery or painting or glass and metal work. Being an expert and a professional is a wonderful thing. But what I deeply appreciate about the professional careers of our graduates is our students go off in 1,000 different directions, and some of those directions are planned, others are more just opportunistic, responding to opportunities, and yet others are deliberately exploring and testing the boundaries of what can you do with a degree in. And to give you two examples, we have recently launched master's degrees in information experience design
Mm,
and another master's degree called digital direction. And these are graduate programs that are thinking very actively, very critically about our current digital, experiential, data info realities and
yeah.
thinking about how do we give creative agency, shape, direction to these virtual digital environments and experiences that we live in, as well as responding to the era of big data and how we deal with the sort of the oversupply of information in the
Yeah.
world we live in. And so the career paths for those students, they're joining fields that are still emerging and being shaped.
I mean, it strikes me that as we're talking, we keep referring to art and design education. And I think there is clearly overlap between art and design, but there are also divergences there. You came from an architecture school previously, and I'm wondering how you see the overlap of art, design, and education, both for yourself, but also for the RCA, because it's interesting to think about the context of this conversation where something like architecture, for example, is a defined field, defined discipline, defined profession, which is very different than painting. But when they are all a part of the same institution, what are the points of connection there? What are the points of divergences? How do you sort of think about that's the sort of moving Venn diagram of art, design, architecture?
So we are called the Royal College of Art. But in 1837, almost 185 years ago, when we were created, we were named the Government School of Design.
Mm,
And I think it's really interesting how we
yeah.
grew out of the Government School of Design into the Royal College of Art. And
Wow.
since I started here, a number of colleagues have come up to me and asked, am I going to do something as silly as trying to rename the college something else? And some people are asking, well, shouldn't we be the Royal College of Art and Design? Others are saying it's really difficult to activate that word design. Others think we should drop art and just be design. And what it suggests to me is that our community is thinking about this coexistence or this conjunction between art and design that really is a big part of our intellectual and creative DNA.
Mm,
But at the same time, I don't think those questions need resolution. I think the fact that there are overlaps as well as boundaries between art and design is perfectly helpful, productive thing to live with. So rather than try to categorize and organize and give stronger disciplinary identity and definition to the art side of the school and the design side of the school, I actually think we need to embrace what you described, which is the ecosystem in which all of this can coexist and talk to each other. And
Mm.
if you go back a few decades, I've been meeting alumni recently from the 70s and 80s and even the
Uh,
60s and hearing about their experience. One of the things they describe, which we still try and do today, but we've gotten much bigger in the intervening decades. But one of the things they describe is how you could come to the RCA for painting, but you could also play around and work with furniture making, industrial design,
mhm.
photography, sculpture. One of the great values of being in a postgraduate university like ours is the close proximity of all these disciplines in the same buildings, many times sharing the same floors. And you could just literally walk across and try something new and figure out
Yeah.
what are the intersections between, say, graphic design and animation.
Word interdisciplinary is sort of a buzzword right now. You hear interdisciplinary, non-disciplinary, multidisciplinary. Your background, I think, speaks to that. You've been in situations where you're sort of crossing disciplines like this. And I was watching an interview that you gave a couple years ago, and you talked about interdisciplinarity as not about flattening, not about making all the disciplines the same. You described it as looking for the points of connection between them, and those points of connection can be where they agree. It could be where they disagree. Just where are the overlapping relations there, and that strikes me as correct. I think that's a good way to think about that, but I'm wondering what that actually looks like in practice. And the institutions that I have been in, there is a lot of talk about interdisciplinary thinking, but then there's also a lot of territorializing. There is a, well, this is what we do over here. This is what you do. Like, oh, you're encroaching here. How do you think about actually putting that into practice, actually actually having students who are studying painting and then they go and take a industrial design class or whatever? How do you actually sort of set up structures that encourage and promote that while also um, resist the flattening that you're talking about?
One of the challenges we have at any university is that as an institution, we like to create um, boundaries. We compartmentalize, we classify, we organize. And you talked about territorialization. Well, that's exactly what the whole concept of a discipline does. It creates a territory, it territorializes knowledge.
Right.
And the irony is that if you go back to the foundations of the modern university in kind of like medieval times and so on, is that the boundaries between science and art were not there.
Right.
We built them up over time.
Right.
So right now we are having a podcast conversation about interdisciplinary gaps and spaces between art and design disciplines, but there are bigger gaps out there, which are between art and design and all the other disciplines.
Right.
And to me, it's fascinating that over time we have institutionalized these knowledge communities to the point where they have such strong institutional identities and bureaucracies behind them, like budget lines and space allocations and all these things that universities do,
Right.
that make it harder and harder over the centuries to actually do the thing that we all want to do in a university, which is to create and share knowledge.
Right.
So if you then go to somewhere like the RCA and look at how we approach it, one of the advantages of being an art and design university is that we can bring together a whole range of disciplines that have interests in common, have reasons to be talking with each other, to be in dialogue with each
Mm.
other. It's very difficult if you are doing something like print to not take an interest in graphic design
Right.
or to not pay attention to the photography students who are in the room next to you.
Right.
and making our work very visual, very, very accessible, something that can be experienced and seen walking the hallways in our many exhibitions throughout the year and the big one at the end of the year. You need to see and experience work that challenges your assumptions, what you think you know. And there's also scales of interdisciplinarity. So there's what an individual can do. You could be, for instance, an animator slash jewelry maker slash photographer slash sculptor slash architect,
Right.
or you could be interested in climate justice
Mm,
and the role that creative practice can play in that, and bring together a group that has an architect, a
mhm,
graphic
mhm,
designer, an animator, and sculptor, and so on,
mhm.
and bring your knowledge together. But the key to all of this, and I don't know if I said this in the interview that you watched, but the key to all of this is we need to know something in order to
Uh,
collaborate and be interdisciplinary.
yeah,
So when we think about interdisciplinary collaboration, we've got to bring some level of expertise to that exchange.
right.
And so, to me, at the heart of interdisciplinarity is advanced knowledge and practice. But what allows it to evolve and to go in new and surprising directions is when you take what you think is knowledge and you let it be confronted by knowledge from an adjacent area. And we try to do that in lots of ways. We have exhibitions that share space. We have programs like our Contemporary Art Practice Masters, which allow students to move between media,
Yeah.
to move between different areas of practice. And what we're noticing is more and more of our students are actually interested in exploring not just the boundaries of their discipline, but what happens when you step outside of your comfort zone. And I think that's an important thing you can do in a graduate degree that maybe is a little harder to do at an undergraduate level as you're still developing your voice, your confidence, your identity, your skills. But at a
Yeah.
graduate level, you can really test yourself, your own boundaries, your own comfort levels, and try and go a step further. And we really encourage our students to do that.
It's interesting to hear you say that because I feel like in a lot of ways you're describing your own, I don't mean to make this about you, but you're describing your own uh, intellectual interests and sort of career trajectory. If I'm not mistaken, your PhD was in Victorian literature.
That is correct,
So,
especially looking at the social realist novels of Anthony Trollope.
so tell me how that sort of deep knowledge influences the work you're doing now, where you are confronting all of these different disciplines and you have this sort of base. What from that education shaped the work that you've done since?
Well, it's probably important to explain
Okay, go
that
for it.
the PhD was a long time ago. So if
Right.
I were to try to step from what I was doing and what I thought I knew when I finished my PhD right into the space I'm now working in, and forget the role, but just the kind of space that I'm now
Yeah.
working in, that would have been a step too far at that time. But what I learned through doing the PhD in Victorian literature is that many areas of cultural production, cultural practice speak to each other. So literature does not exist in isolation, doesn't come out of nowhere. And it's part of a larger artistic, creative moment or community or
Mhm.
culture, whatever you want to describe. And understanding what's happening around literature in other art forms is really important to understanding literature if that's what you're interested in. So for me, the study of literature became and opened the door to the study of the visual arts, of
Mhm.
architecture, of urban planning, of cultural history, and over time, exploring those interests through teaching, through research and publication, allowed me to find the interdisciplinary space where I felt comfortable working, and that's at the intersection of a number of different fields.
And those intersections that that's sort of you've done a lot of writing and thinking around media and media studies. You've done a lot of thinking around architecture, around cities, around culture and popular culture. And alongside this work leading institutions, you've had an active research practice. And I'm curious about how those interests that you have, how does that influence how you think about leading a school, running an institution, building a culture. I'm wondering about sort of how all of that actually on a day-to-day level influences the work that you've done for the last 20 years or so at this point.
I have personal views on that, which I recognize may not be shared by everyone. But having spent my entire working life in academic spaces as an academic in one form or another, um, I've really come to the view that leaders of institutions need to have some degree of an academic background.
Mm,
I think to shape and chart the strategic direction of a university, you need, and it doesn't matter so much the discipline, but you need to understand how universities work, what students experience, what faculty experience, what staff experience, and an understanding of how knowledge communities, whether it's medicine or engineering or the arts, how they evolve over time, why certain concepts gain traction, why there's always a shelf life on that, and a new concept comes in, what's trendy, what's not, how does that work?
right.
But maybe more importantly, what is the role of a university in engaging with and being part of a society, the societies and global societies around us? So I'm a big fan of academic leaders, whether it's a department head, a program director, deans, provosts, presidents, having a grounding and having lived experience of academic life.
Hmm.
But the other thing is that I do think that the research and teaching activity that I did over uh, uh, multiple decades has profoundly shaped the way I think about the strategic direction and shaping of higher education.
Mm,
And when people ask, what is your job? What do you do as a university president? It's exactly the same kind of question I used to get when I was a dean. Well, what do you do as a dean? And I used to say to my children, if you look at popular culture, can you think of a single positive example of a dean? Is there a movie or a TV show where the dean is a good person? Or even a hero, or just someone you would even want in the room.
yeah.
And I think that extends to university presidents, administrators, and it's because of that popular perception that what we do is bureaucracy, admin. We say no to people. We relish spreadsheets and
Hmm.
numbers and tightening
Hmm.
belts and efficiencies and those kinds of words. And maybe those people are out there. I haven't worked with them. I haven't come across that. What I've experienced, and I like to describe it as university leadership rather than administration or management. What
Mm,
I've experienced in university leadership at every stage, from department and program chair through to where I am now, is that these roles are extraordinarily creative.
hmm.
These are the roles through which you can actually open up the new spaces for inquiry and experimentation. And that's what drew me into this work, was not a love of spreadsheets. I still don't have that. What drew me into this work was the ability, collaborating with students, staff, faculty around me, to invent and create new things and to support those parts of a university that need support and need advocacy. So, for instance, the ability to create a new degree to respond to emerging fields or emerging technologies or emerging challenges in our world, such as the climate crisis, um, to be able to make that a priority and to work with others to fund and support that, and then attract students into a degree, and then hire the faculty and staff, the expertise you need to deliver that degree, and then graduate these students and let them go out and change the world. I mean, that to me is exactly what all the research and teaching for me, I always dreamt it could lead to, and I'm so glad that it has.
Yeah, I love that, and I think that's well said. I've talked to dozens of um, deans and presidents, and they've all refer to this work as creative, as a type of design project in and of itself. It's a lot of those same skills. As you were saying that, I was thinking about last year I interviewed your architecture dean, Adrian Lahoud, and he said something in that conversation that I think about a lot, probably too much. And he said the sort of the default culture in academia for a lot of people is paranoia and anxiety. I've heard from a lot of people who listen to that who felt that rings true for them also. And I think that speaks to this sort of negative perception of college, higher education leadership. And you've been doing this for a while. I was reading about your time at the University of Oregon, where you sort of changed the name of the school and reorganized, and that seems like that was somewhat controversial, and there were some departments that were unhappy. I'm wondering how you think about culture building and how you think about the balance between your creative interests, your scholarship, your expertise, and the community at large. Where do those come together? How do you start to think about uh you know setting a vision, bringing everyone along? Can you just sort of talk me through how you think about that and how you approach that part of the job?
I've had a lot of experience working to create culture change, as well as to design organizational change, so structural as well. And I've done that in Amsterdam, in Oregon, at UCL here in London, and now at the RCA, also in London. And across all that experience, I suppose if I were to look back and reflect on it, one of the things I've learned is that the approach to culture change, or the approach to change of any kind at a university, the way to do it is not the same in every place.
Mm,
I've always found it really important to try, and some people would say I'm successful, some people would say I'm disastrous at this, but I do think it's important to try to understand the local values, cultures,
mm,
traditions, practices when you join an institution, because that's what you have to work with and through in order to make
right,
change.
right.
But it doesn't mean accepting all of that.
Mm,
And I remember we were talking before we started recording a little bit about the role of critical theory in your own trajectory,
right.
which I think is brilliant and wonderful. And it reminded me of something I read when I was a graduate student at the time when Jacques Derrida,
Mm,
the famous French philosopher,
yes.
was at his trendiest. And I can't remember where he wrote it, and I can't remember the exact wording, but I remember reading some comments that he made about otherness,
Mm,
and in particular, the figure of the migrant, the exile, and the other, about when that figure joins a community. The change that needs to occur is not just in one direction. It's not just the figure of the other who needs to change
right,
to fit into a community. It is also the community who is changed by welcoming and accepting the other into that
right.
community.
Yeah.
And universities are places where that figure of the other, let's call them students, faculty, staff, we are communities where people are constantly joining us. And when we recruit well, when we recruit at our best, what we're doing is we're recruiting people who know things we don't know, who've been to places we've not been to, who speak languages we don't yet speak. And there's an opportunity to learn from them and to be changed by them. And I think that's an important part of the way that universities at their best can function. So if we think about the challenge of change at a university, I believe that we have a perpetual, constant obligation to always be changing at a pace that's manageable, at a pace that allows us to be sustainable and financially viable. But we need to always be changing. Why? Because we are a reflection of the knowledge that's produced in our field, but also a reflection of a society that's also always changing. So if we want to be at the cutting edge of our disciplines, if we want to be creating new knowledge, new paradigms, new understandings, and so on, then we have to be willing to change as part of that process. And I think in that, to me, is one of the most exciting parts about contemporary higher education. That the world we live in,
Yeah.
this is not the exciting part, this is the depressing part, but then I'll get to the exciting part. The depressing part is the world we live in, we are facing major, some might say existential challenges,
Hmm.
particularly around climate change,
Hmm.
its intersections with inequality,
Hmm.
especially around global health inequalities, the role that technology can play in exacerbating that, as well as potentially helping us to solve that. We are entering a future where we need to change quite fast and quite radically in order to survive that future that's coming at us. And so, a new form of justice that we need to be spending more time talking about, I believe, is intergenerational justice.
Mm.
And everything we do at a university, because of the time horizons that we work on, we need to be thinking about how we are sharing knowledge with new generations, next generations, and how what we do needs to pass and be shared across generations going forward. When you put all that together, I think universities are in a very, very privileged, unique, special place to play a very powerful role in shaping our future. And we're not going to see it next year or the year after. We're planting seeds.
Yeah.
And as those grow, they're going to shape the values of our world. They're going to shape what we're capable of doing, what we want to do, what we think we're capable of. And for that reason, change is essential.
Let me ask you this question first. This is, I think, a smaller question. In that interview that I mentioned that I watched, where you were talking about interdisciplinarity, you mentioned that what you love about academia, and this speaks to your own career, is that you said you can research and teach your way out of anything and into anything. And I was thinking about that as you were talking about this sort of constant need for change. And I think I really like that idea that you can research and teach your way out of anything and into anything. And I think you can think about that on a big scale, like the scale you're talking about now. But I think you can also think about that just on a small scale, like yourself going from Victorian literature to media studies to urban studies. And I've joked, but there is some truth to this, that this podcast is for designers who don't want to be designers anymore. And I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about how you think about, on the personal level, thinking about those changes, how to move your research, how to move your teaching, how to move your work to sort of account for the changes that you're seeing. How do you think about that, whether that's mentoring faculty, whether that's working with
Mhm.
students, to be open to that constant moving that I feel like is really a theme of this whole conversation?
One of the ironies that I've experienced, and I imagine many in the audience, if they're academics, will recognize this, is despite all the potential in what we do to be radical, to be avant-garde, to really be, edgy, how much of university life um, either encourages us or forces us to be conventional. And a great
Okay.
place to look for that. And there is a segue between these comments and your question. A great place to see that in action is in the North American tenure system,
Mm.
and how narrow sometimes, not everywhere, but sometimes the lens is for what constitutes the right level of publication, of accomplishment, teaching success to qualify for tenure. Um, I really appreciate how in the UK system, for example, many universities, and especially somewhere like the RCA, which is creative practice-led institution, contributions to research and teaching excellence can take many, many, many more forms. And we can be really, really open-minded about what constitutes a contribution to our field.
Mm.
And I've seen as a dean previously the ways in which something very bureaucratic, but also professionally and economically essential to a faculty member, tenure, um, puts constraints over creativity and the ability to take risks. We want our faculty to take risks. We want people to experiment, try new things. So I think the key to being able to have an academic career that can explore new areas where you can write or teach your way out of anything into
Mhm.
anything, is having a bit more safety and support from your university to actually
Mm.
try that. And it can be very high stakes depending on where you are in your career, particularly if you're early career. It can be very, very high stakes to try and do that. So I would love to advocate for a future in the way that we review and value the academic work of our faculty to be much more open-minded about what constitutes a contribution to knowledge. And if you take that more open-minded approach, what starts to happen is not only are you able to give more confidence and optimism to your faculty and get better work, you'll see, I think, stronger, more critical work happening, but you'll also, as a university, start to see and experience the impact that that art and design or any work in the university can have. So when you start to think about podcasts as a really, really vital way, particularly in today's world of
Mhm.
knowledge exchange and creating knowledge communities. You go back 20 years, if you were to put a podcast on a tenure case, what would happen? I hope
Right.
that many universities today would see value in a podcast and understand that there is actually research that goes into it. There's critical dialogue happening. There's an element of peer review.
I'm
That
just going to submit. I'm
it
submitting this quote when I go up for tenure in 2 years. 'Cause you're making my case for me.
and all the things that we can do alongside and in addition to a podcast. But the key thing in this is, and it goes back to a question you asked right at the beginning, which is, why is higher education under assault? Why, in certain political discourses in many parts of the world, are universities being vilified
Hmm.
as elite, out of touch knowledge communities? And one of the reasons is we don't engage enough with the publics that we're
Mm.
connected to. And I think research is a great way to engage, not in a condescending, I'll tell you what you need to know in your life because I'm an expert, but rather we have something really cool, exciting, interesting, new, different, and we want to share it with people who might find value in it. And we do that across all of our disciplines all the time. And yet we're not able to fully explore the ways in which we can do that knowledge exchange outside of traditional academic modes as much as I think we could do in the future.
My last question for you, I want to sort of circle back to the beginning of this conversation. You're situated in this new role. You're thinking about the future of the RCA. You're thinking about the future of art education. What's can you tell us a little bit about what's next for the RCA? What are the things you're working on? What are the things you're excited about? What are the initiatives or the ideas now that you've sort of settled in? Um, where do you want to take all of this?
So that is the key question for me. That keeps me up at night, that I think about when I wake up in the morning, that I'm trying to talk with to anyone who will listen around campus, because that's the key question. Where do we want to take things? And at this stage, I can let you know some of the questions I'm asking. I don't yet have all of the answers, and that's important because um, where do we go as a community is up to many, many people. It's not up to just me. I have some ideas. I can throw them in the mix. They might get traction. They might resonate. They might make sense. But where we take the RCA over the coming years is something that we need to do and want to do together across the whole college. So some of the questions that I'm asking, when I arrived, I was very fortunate to start as president the very month that the RCA was announced as the #1 ranked art and design university in the
Right.
world for the 10th consecutive year. What an accomplishment.
Yeah.
But to me, that raises a question. What does it mean to be #1? And really, I would rephrase that and say it's not about #1, it's about leadership. What does
Uh,
it mean to be in a very, very fortunate position of having a global leadership voice in art and design education?
mhm.
And with that, what responsibility do we have to convene conversations about the future, not just of the RCA's education, but actually more broadly of art and design education worldwide. So one of the things that I think is really important is that art and design schools collaborate and connect across geographies, across the world. We need to not be in competition with each other. We need to be in collaboration with each other. And I am hopeful that the role, the image, the prestige that we have at the RCA is something we can use to draw more institutions into a collaborative conversation about where, more broadly in the field of creative education, if you want to call it that, where are we going?
Yeah.
And if you talk to the students who are here, and I don't know if it's the same with you at NC State, what I'm hearing a lot of is our students want to engage real issues in the real world.
Yep. Yep.
And the two issues that are coming out the most in the work that we're seeing at the moment is the climate crisis
Mm-hmm.
and inequality in our world.
Mm-hmm.
And it's coming out, and you're seeing that expressed, explored in painting, in print, in photography, in animation, in sculpture, in architecture, in urban design. I mean, we're seeing it across every one of our 30 programs. And I think it goes back to that question of intergenerational justice.
Yeah.
We have students joining us now who are facing a really challenging future. In the coming 30, 50 years, students who will live through radical, extreme transformations to our world, to our societies, cities, and to the way that we live, the way that we do everything. So we are at the beginning of a couple of decades of very accelerated climate change, and the impact that that's going to have on health, on migration, on prosperity, on innovation is going to be so profound, but also very, very painful for many parts of our world. And this is top of mind for our students. They're very concerned about this and have a lot to say. Just as importantly, they have ideas to contribute. And this is one of the things I like to say that maybe gets me in hot water a bit more than I'm comfortable with. But I keep saying it anyway because I believe it quite passionately. The climate crisis, it's not just a crisis of science. We have the data, we have science. We know that there's a climate crisis unfolding, and we have various technological, scientific things that can contribute to ameliorating the effects of that crisis. But what we still haven't managed to do is change human behavior, change the kind of collective global imagination about our future, change our values to be more caring, be more attuned to how the effects of climate change affects communities. So even within individual cities, just take Miami or London, and you look at how changing weather patterns, flooding, heat, wildfires, and so on, LA, you look at how that affects communities, and it's not even. Even within cities, there's huge unevenness of experience. And it is the world's most vulnerable populations that will disproportionately feel the effects. And our students in art and design want to do something about it. They want to help, they want to contribute. And I think they have a lot to offer.
I think that is exactly right. I think that's a great way to wrap up this conversation. Christoph, thank you so much. This was such a fascinating conversation. Best of luck in the new job, and I hope we get to do this again soon. Thank you so much.
Absolutely, Jarrett. It's been great talking, and let's maybe talk again after tenure, and we can see what else we can talk about.
Yes, I love that. That was my conversation with Christoph Lindner. It was recorded on August 12th, 2024. Our theme music is by Jeremiah Chu. The show is and always will be free thanks to the generosity of our Patreon supporters. If you like what we're doing here, I hope you consider supporting us and get some bonus content each month. You can follow us across social media at Surface Podcast, and you can listen to all of our previous episodes wherever you get your podcasts and at our website, scratchingthesurface.fm. Thanks for listening.